Hello, and welcome to Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Racism, Migration, and Climate. Here's our host, Cherish Budzinski.
Hello and welcome. Today's conversation is the first of a series about some of the biggest social issues of our time and the complex intersections of these topics with racism, migration, and climate. This program is made possible through the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, Region 10. Over the coming year, we'll host monthly panel conversations about the topics that shape our lives as humankind. Among them, food security, human trafficking, gun violence, affordable housing, healthcare, and much more. We live in a time when so many of us get our information in bite-sized pieces from social media. But in truth, all of the issues we will be talking about are highly nuanced and interconnected and require much more than a tweet, a meme, or a TikTok to understand. It all comes down to educating ourselves and helping one another along in our quest for deeper understanding. I think often of a sign held high by an elderly man at one of last summer's marches, which read, "I'm sorry it took me so long to get here. I had a lot to learn." Whether you are a person of faith or someone who adheres to no religious tradition, we're glad you're here. All of us are here to grow, to better understand the world around us and the ways we can individually and collectively affect change. At times, things could get uncomfortable, as these topics are likely to challenge each of us in some way. Because the fact is, all of us have a lot to learn. We are committed to helping one another along on our journey. So in addition to these conversations with our panelists, we'll have some suggested action items in each program, things you can do as we move forward. And we'll have additional resources, which you can find on our website, exploringintersections.org. Please note, members of our Zoom audience are encouraged to submit questions for our panelists to consider, and you can do so by using the Q&A function. In this episode of Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Racism, Migration, and Climate, we're talking about gender equity. So what is gender equity? According to the United Nations, equal access to resources and opportunities regardless of gender is a fundamental human right and essential to achieve full human potential and sustainable societal development. In this episode, we're talking about how gender equity is interconnected with the issues of racism, migration, and climate change. The facts are astounding. Equality seems far out of reach, and that's because it is. The World Economic Forum projects it'll take 170 years to reach gender equality globally, and 158 years in North America. Often the terms equity and equality are used interchangeably. So it's important to draw a distinction between the two. The term equality means everyone gets the same thing, no matter what their needs are. The term equity means everyone gets everything they need to be the same. Gender equity means individuals don't have to be treated the same, but that their rights, responsibilities, and opportunities do not depend on if they were born male, female, or other gendered. Gender equity means fairness of treatment for all people according to their respective needs. It may include equal treatment or treatment that is different, but which is considered equivalent in terms of rights, benefits, obligations, and of course, opportunities. With that distinction in mind, we'll be using the term equity in our conversation about gender today. To help us better understand today's topic, we are joined by three panelists. Beth Allen is the Director of Affiliation for the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration and has been an affiliate in the community for 15 years. Her education includes master's degrees in counselor education and pastoral ministries. She is also a certified chaplain through the National Association of Catholic Chaplains. She believes that to truly embrace the gospel message is to join the effort that not only promotes gender equity, but human dignity for all in social, religious, and political arenas. Welcome, Beth.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Janae Jones is an undergrad at Missouri State University with plans to pursue a master's degree in social work. Her career goal is to become a licensed clinical social worker within a healthcare or school system. And she would like to start a nonprofit that supports minorities in education, health, and mental health. She has worked with incredibly strong women through her membership with a sorority, which has fueled her passion for advocating for women's rights and the impact and voice they can have in their communities and states. Welcome, Janae.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here today. Also, I was recently accepted into my grad program.
Oh. Congratulations! That's a great way to kick off the program. And our third guest today is Sister Joan Mitchell, a sister of St. Joseph of Carondelet, a writer and a teacher who has created religious education programs for more than 35 years. Sister Joan earned a BA in English from St. Catherine University, an MA in American Literature at the University of Iowa, a master's in theological studies through Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD in New Testament from Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. Her passion for exploring gender equity began after taking Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza's course, Gospel Women and Discovered Feminist Scripture Study. For 26 years, Sister Joan has joined the work in reclaiming women's significance in scripture and church history. Welcome, Sister Joan.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Let's all start by talking about gender equity in relationship to our own lives. I don't know a single woman who doesn't have a gender equity related story about her personal experience. How have each of you experienced gender inequities on a personal level? And how has that shaped your life studies and work? Sister Joan, let's start with you.
You know, I love that word, equity. And I think I understood it first in the family. My younger sister is profoundly deaf. And so if she was lucky enough to have a mother who was a teacher who used the 15% of hearing she did have to help her learn to speak. And she also got help lip reading so she could participate fully in life, you know, as a talking person. Otherwise, she probably wouldn't have been able to. So that was an early experience of equity. And for myself, you know, everybody's valuable in the farm work when I was growing up, and I went up to a women's college to go to school, and you've heard all of that, and then joined the Sisters of St. Joseph, who, you know, want you to do all of which women is capable. And then somebody got a job that I thought I was better qualified for when I was working in publishing, and I became a feminist. So
rightfully so.
Yeah. Well, and you heard how that class changed my life. It was a wonderful class because it had women would come in off the sidewalks with their stroller, babies in their strollers. There were women in the class who'd been in El Salvador as missionaries and were on respite at home. There were, you know, serious students like me, and we were all there together to meet those women in the gospel that we hadn't paid much attention to either. So I've been doing that ever since.
That sounds like a powerful class. Beth, how about you? Tell us how you've experienced gender equity on a personal level or inequity.
I like to speak to this from both a social and religious perspective. So in different social settings I find myself in with my husband, for example, especially in a business environment like applying for a loan. it's automatically assumed that his name is written first on forms that we need to sign. Explanations are often directed toward him. And I also notice these kind of subtle nonverbals that assume he's the leader in our partnership. We can blindly believe that that's the right way to behave with each other rather than see the discrimination underneath it. So, how does that personally shape me? I often speak up when I notice these injustices, but I feel guilty, almost as if I'm whining or complaining when I do so. So I see the injustice clearly, but it's harder for me personally to separate out that deep-seated cultural message. So that cultural message that continually plays in my mind repeatedly is that it's actually my job as a woman to be meek, quiet, polite, and doing anything other than that is misbehaving or drawing inappropriate attention to myself. And I think a lot of women in the audience here today can relate to what I'm saying. I find too, I want to speak to world religions here too in that perspective, but I find that world religions have much to learn on emphasizing gender inclusive language in referencing God. We are accustomed to predominantly masculine language and imagery for the divine in all of our faith traditions. Yet I would propose this question to our audience. How are we as women able to truly see the sacred within ourselves equal to that of men if God continues to be portrayed as masculine? In worship settings I find myself in, I experience male privilege in many forms, and it leaves me feeling both discounted and disconnected to the mission and the identity of the congregation.
That makes a lot of sense. Janae, how about for you? How have you experienced gender inequity?
For me, I think the most times that I've experienced it has been within education, within sports that I've played, and also just within the healthcare system. For example, in education, sometimes when I would answer a question, people wouldn't necessarily hear me. Kind of what Beth was talking about, they would automatically look to a male in the room for the answer rather than listening to me, or have a male repeat what I was saying and then try and take ownership of that, which at a young age, I truly fought back on that one. So I realized at an early age that I was very passionate about having my voice heard. Within sports, I found that as I play golf, I've played since I was about 7 years old. I found that when I went to a golf course, more men would look at me like, what are you doing here? Like, this isn't your place. This isn't where you belong. Even though, I'm going to be honest, sometimes I did golf better than the men. And when they saw that, they kind of felt offended in a way that I was well off at a young age and also a woman. And I think that's also something that got me starting to see like how there wasn't an equal balance. And within the healthcare system, I think it's mostly that I realized my voice wasn't being as heard as much as other people's were. And I think all of these things kind of shaped me in a way that made me want to fight for like people's voices to be heard continuously and make sure that everyone has the right to have their voice heard.
I love that. And you have so much road ahead of you. Surely we'll see how that manifests in the near future. It's very exciting. So Janae, as a woman of color, you've experienced gender inequities through the lens of racism as well. Tell us how that has become apparent to you.
For me personally, I started to realize this at a very early age, and it was within the healthcare system. It was the first major time was when I went to a doctor because I was having really bad problems with my period. And I won't go into depth about what that means, but I was knowing that something wasn't right within my body and that I needed to talk to someone about it. As soon as I went to 2 different doctors. And the first time they said, you know what, this is just how it has to be. This is just what you have to deal with. And you're just kind of exaggerating your pain. You need to calm down. That was the first time. It was a male doctor that was white. And then the second time I went to another white female doctor and pretty much heard the same thing. So after hearing people tell me that I was the one that was in the wrong, I started to believe that I didn't know my body, or maybe since they were in a place where they had been to school, that I was wrong about things. And I thought this for a long time. And it made me start to like question if I really wanted to go to doctors for help. It wasn't until I think my sophomore year in college where I had to end up going to urgent care because I was in so much pain and I knew that there was something that was wrong, that they suggested that I go to a gynecologist and talk to a doctor about endometriosis. When I finally did that, that was the first time I had ever felt heard in that regard. She talked to me about endometriosis and how the side effects can happen and also different symptoms people experience. And when I was telling her what I was going through and I told her that I'd been to doctors about it, she was surprised that no one had ever mentioned it to me or wasn't believing that my symptoms were real. And as I got older and started learning more about the world and started learning more from social work, I realized this wasn't a thing that I was only experiencing. I realized that women have these problems when they go to talk to about medical professionals about having heart problems. And the first question they ask, well, are you under a lot of stress, ma'am? Are you anxious about something?
Yeah.
Rather than with men, sometimes the first thing they go to is, oh, this man has physical symptoms. They need to treat that first. And then in regards to women of color, especially minority women, I noticed that within so sorry, I'm a little bit nervous today.
You're doing great.
With maternal mortality rates, women of color are dying so much more than women that aren't a color of it. And I started realizing these things. And I noticed that it wasn't just my struggle, but the struggle of so many women and so many women of color that weren't being listened to by their doctors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that problem actually transcends color as well. Women in general feel often discounted, or that they're made to feel like their symptoms are not real or they're overplaying them. So it's
That it's
devastating.
mostly in their head rather than being real physical symptoms that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
And even that little oxygen calibration thing is not calibrated for Black skin. So you're, when you try to see your oxygen level in COVID,
A
doesn't
pulse
work with Black
oximeter.
skin.
Yeah.
I didn't know that, but that makes a lot of sense. I'm an asthmatic, and every time they put the thing, the little tester on me, they're like, oh, you're breathing just fine. And I'm like, I am wheezing. I am out of breath. Something is wrong.
Yeah.
Devastating to have to go through all of that, though, before you got a diagnosis and figured out what was going on. Janae, sticking with you, how have gender norms in your family life affected your ability to get where you are today?
For me, I'm very fortunate and I have a very supportive family, but something that I noticed at an early age is the differences that I was shown between me and my brother, who's 10 years older. So for me, I am an adventurous person. I love to find out new things. I love to talk to new people and go to new places, while my brother is a little bit more reserved and he'd be completely fine just staying at home and staying where he is. I started noticing this a lot more when I was talking about going to college and I was looking out of state. I was looking at different places, studying abroad, and all these amazing things. And I noticed that some of my family members were extremely worried about me going out into the world and trying to find a different place to study and just learn more about life. But on the other hand, with my brother, they were pushing him to go. And I realized that it was maybe this unconscious effort that they wanted me to be protected because I was a woman. And they saw it as possibly me not being able to protect myself in the real world. But since my brother was a man, they assumed that he'd be able to fend for himself and do everything. And luckily, as I got older, I had very strong support systems that enforced, at the end of the day, you have to follow your heart and follow what you think is the best. And that really helped me stand by what my beliefs were and stand by the fact that I knew who I was at the end of the day and I knew how to protect myself.
Beautiful, beautifully said. We should also mention, of course, that it's National Catholic Sisters Week, which makes it the perfect time to talk about the important work of sisters. Sister Joan, I know you personally have a passion for preaching. Tell us how that has come to fruition in your life and work.
Well, I think I got started at weddings and funerals in the family and went on from there. And you also hear another thing that kind of prodded me into it was hearing the funeral sermons for our sisters, where the poor priests had never met them, didn't know them, and were unable to give a sermon relevant to the person's life. So I thought we should start doing our own sermons, and that's been very successful. And I went on from that when I was in divinity school. I did the first service I'd really led that was kind of a more priestly role. And we did it on the feast. I did it on the Feast of St. Joseph. And there's a tradition in Italian circles of giving bread or meals to the poor on that day. So I have distributed bread, good things to eat, to everybody who was at the service. And I also made a personal commitment that day, which is now quite a while ago, to always accept an invitation to preach and to also try to make times to preach. So now, you know, I've been speaking, I've been teaching, I've been doing a lot of things, but I wanted to do that preaching part too. And especially after studying scripture, you know, I began to know a lot about scripture, and we did our magazines centered on the Gospels. So I wanted to take all I knew and put it into preaching. So I've done a lot, and I get invited more and more.
I love that you challenged yourself to never turn down an opportunity to preach.
No, I know, no. And I've preached in lots of parishes. I've preached in my home parish for the centennial, as the only sister to ever come from this little town. I grew up on the Catholic Worker. That's not, a very radical newspaper. And we were in the heart of all the new ways. We had a very young clergyman as our priest. And so I grew up wanting to have a writing voice and a speaking voice. And some people sing when they're out in the tractors. I used to give lectures and stuff. So I think I was sort of born to preach. And I'd become a deacon if I could, but I think I am anyway. So
yeah. So along those lines, Sister Joan, with respect to gender equity, how have you seen the roles of women in the church change over time? I know that's a big question.
Well, it's a big question, but it's a painful one. It hasn't changed a lot. We did have a lot of change at first after Vatican II. We had sisters who became parish workers, and then parish associates, and then parish leaders became actually kind of pastor sisters in parishes, especially in the country, sometimes in Newmans. Chaplaincy became a way for sisters to do priestly work. They can't do it all. They can't anoint, they can't consecrate, they can't do confessions, but they can do all the rest of the pastoral work. But a lot of that has been pulled back. So they don't, different dioceses, the bishop can pull you back, your pastor can pull you back, or pastor changes, and then everything that you've been able to do is gone. So I think Pope Francis is trying to do something about it, but it's probably going to be a very long way. So I guess I urge people, I always try to get people interested in doing more to promote women in the church, because I think if you aren't active, if you don't take an agent's role that you can do this, nothing will ever happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why I wanted to preach, that people get much more used to it. And if you're good, they appreciate it. And they appreciate your message. So I know Thea Bowman, I think, Beth, you probably know, Thea once got criticized for, how come you're preaching? And she said, I'm not preaching, I'm witnessing. But, the percentage of people who can see women in priestly roles has gone up in the last decades.
So interesting.
But, it's not easy for clerics who don't have a lot of interaction with women to recognize what women would bring. Yeah. That they're missing half the church, they're missing half the gifts. They actually don't know the realities of women, a lot of them, if not most of them, because the world seems to be their world. And women have to know their world. We have to know ours. If you're Black, you have to know another world. I mean, there's a need for many voices.
Yeah, absolutely. Beth, when we talk about gender equity, tell us, what do non-binary and trans people need from the leaders of their faith traditions? And how can people of faith help achieve equity for these members of our family of humankind who are so often marginalized?
My biggest thought on that is to speak up, to raise your voice.
Yeah.
It's actually one reason why I love affiliating with the FSPA. I find that they do this really well with this sense of grace. Most viewers, I'm assuming, are familiar with the recent Equity Act bill passed by the House of Representatives. And it doesn't come without controversy, as it bans discrimination against people based on sexual orientation and gender identity, which applies to religious entities as well. The U.S. bishops and Catholics organizations are speaking up, and there's different diverse voices, but one includes a statement called "God is on your side," a statement from Catholic bishops on protecting LGBT youth, and FSPA and LCWR actually signed that statement. It's an effort to join the Tyler Clementine Foundation in standing up for at-risk LGBT youth in our country, who I'm sure many are aware, but they have considerably higher suicide attempts than their straight counterparts, and are the target of violent acts at alarming rates. I would also add that we are so accustomed to operating out of fear from what we do not know or understand. So my advice to people of faith is to also seek to understand. Give one another permission to join the human race, to join our human family, because the truth is, silence begets silence. Hatred, bigotry, discrimination, it doesn't go away by us just kind of simply wishing or praying it away. I think it requires that we take a stand, and we've had some great examples of this in recent history with the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's safe to say that whenever you operate from a place of fear, it's never the most solid of ground to make decisions from anyway. And we see a lot of that. In fact, it feels like it's been cultivated for quite some time in our society. So let's talk about the intersection with migration, which does tie into that fear to some level. Of the 1.3 billion people who are on the move, 70% are women. And we're talking about a difficult and often perilous journey. So we have to ask ourselves how some of that suffering can be lifted. Applying your life experience to this, if you were at the table trying to come up with solutions with women who are migrating, what are the kinds of questions you would want to ask on their behalf? Sister Joan?
Well, I think I would want to ask if they had seen where the children were, if maybe we could make a visit and see where we were keeping them, how they were treated, what they had to eat. I think that would be first. I think people need to be welcomed where they can at least have that much happen. And we have a terrible backlog has happened so that families are even separated, well, for months, even more than years. So that just can't happen. We've got sisters that go to the border, especially sisters who are Spanish speaking, like in McLean. Sister Norma has that wonderful respite place there. Our sisters are in California and Tucson, so they tend to go San Diego regularly and are part of trying to supply what the government isn't supplying. So that's one thing. I think you'd be surprised, though, that this is not only a border problem, because in Minnesota, my sister did Head Start, and they had a craft cheese factory in the town where she did Head Start. And from the beginning, it was mainly very poor people who were white. And by the time she finished 25 years in that work, it was all Latinas and people coming up, you know, that would live in a single room with only like a old part of a car seat for a chair, and just be in the, so they could work, so they could make some money. You know, there's just an undeniable hope in people to be able to raise their families, and you have to migrate.
Yeah.
I also heard something recently. It was a Native American person talking about their success in rerouting near the mountains when their tribe was pushed off the prairies. She said, you know, we have in our midst people who have successfully migrated when they had to. And I thought that was a positive thing to start hearing. We hear so much about the dangers of migration, but clearly people cannot live their lives where they're leaving. And they take such risks, which tells you how important it is to come. So
Absolutely.
I'm sympathetic. I'm sympathetic to the people who feel their jobs are at risk too.
Yeah.
You know, you've got to keep your ear to the ground and try to help all the people that are down in that lower quintile, those, you know, who really need help that they haven't got for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Sister Joan, you bring up a really good point too, that it's possible to have empathy for migrants and at the same time to have empathy for people who feel threatened by that, because they're also having a human experience.
Yeah, yeah. Clearly they
Beth,
do.
any additional thoughts on that? Questions you would ask if you were at the table trying to determine the needs of this migrant population?
I agree with Sister Joan in first assessing the needs. From a counseling standpoint, we're talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs: of safety, security, food, water, shelter. You know, do they hold fears for themselves, their loved ones? You know, personally, I can't even pretend to fathom the horrors that these women face: separation from their children, rape, forced into the sex trafficking trade, including the pornography industry. I mean, so much. But if I was at that table, I also would ask the group in front of me to really enter into the story. Picture a migrant woman's face. Imagine that as your friend. That person is your daughter, your granddaughter, even yourself. Well, Matthew 25 really speaks to me in this way. And so I'm going to share this with you. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you gave me clothing. Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.
Yeah,
Such
that's right.
Janae, anything to add?
I would like to echo what both of them said and how important it is to really address what they need and their needs. And I was actually about to go into Maslow's hierarchy of needs while you were saying that. But I think it's so important to really take a step back and look at what it might, even though we can never fathom what it might be like in their shoes, but at least attempt to see how that would be in the widths you're willing to go to get help. And I think the other thing I would really ask on their behalf to the people is, how far are you willing to go to help those that are really in need? Because I think it's also really important to see how far they're willing to help and how much they're willing to affect change.
Great. So one of the experiences that I've had in my life, I've had the privilege to travel to El Salvador, which Sister Joan, you brought up earlier. And it was part of a cultural immersion experience through the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration in La Crosse, where Beth is, and their cultural immersion program, Global Awareness Through Experience. So through that experience, we went to a village that hadn't had drinking water, safe drinking water, for 40 years, which is just impossible to even fathom unless you're in Flint, I suppose, right? But one of the things that really struck me about that experience is we entered that village and there were no grown men.
Mm.
Now, why were there no men there? They had migrated. And the realization, of course, is that if you see your neighbor has migrated and is sending remittances back home, and those children are eating as a result, then there's also that cultural pressure to provide for your own family when the opportunities are really scant there. So that was a really powerful experience to me. And of course, the lack of water issue is one that's growing, right? And as the effects of climate change take hold, and those effects of climate change also highlight existing gender inequities. Why is this a critical part of the gender equity discussion?
Water.
Well, just in general, why is climate change a critical part of the gender equity discussion? What lands on the shoulders of these of migrant women?
You know, I'm aware, I wonder if people realize that most farmers in the world are women.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
We have the World Food Prize down in Iowa as a group that does a lot with African people, and you know, most of they had programs for women because they were the ones who were providing the food for the family and growing it. And it's interesting that Heifer International in helping learn to work with the women, that until you got the women enlisted, they weren't making it, the gifts weren't making the difference they could in the family or in how they were raising their crops. So I think, you know, it's a very dramatic, concrete example of how basic women are to the world, and they were just being bypassed.
Right. And the survival of their children often depends solely on them, particularly if the men have already migrated. That's a tremendous amount of stress.
Yeah. Well,
Go ahead.
I heard a terrible story from Brazil about a bishop, about a woman who was in charge of social justice work for the diocese, taking the bishop to see how people were living. And there was a woman there with a baby who was nursing, and the baby kept crying. And the bishop asked her to stop the crying. And she opened her shirt to show him that her breast was bleeding, that she did not have enough food to have breast milk. You know, it just seems tragic, but that's how different the worlds are. So we need to have empathy to understand where other people come from and what they need. We need to travel in their worlds, hear their voices.
Absolutely. Beth, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was going to add that I think as we explore these intersections, I think it's helpful to introduce new terminology. So one term that I find useful is eco-justice, which means, you know, valuing ecology and justice together, understanding that there's little environmental health without socioeconomic justice and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Pope Francis's encyclical Laudate Si, that I'm sure many of the audience are familiar with, on care for our common home, highlights the term integral ecology.
Yeah.
And the definition of integral ecology points to these numerous intersections, including the ways in which women and children, as Sister Joan was alluding to, are disproportionately affected by climate change. So for me, the teaching is just really clear. We must address all of these injustices together in order to create lasting and effective change.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an enormous task before us, right? So I think it's all too easy for people to sort of separate the issue of gender equity from their faith tradition. Why is gender equity an issue that people of faith or no religious tradition should support? Beth?
I'm going to begin answering this by what the United Nations has revealed, that 1 in 3 women have experienced physical and/or sexual violence. 1 in 3 women. It's not an ancient issue or a matter of a person's faith perspective. I would call that a present day human crisis. I also personally come from this spiritual framework that much of what we've been talking about here today is ultimately about universal values and universal truths that are held with the majority of all of us, all peoples, cultures, traditions. And I find that too often our society has emphasized our diverse beliefs as a mechanism to separate us and our efforts together. I imagine, honestly, some people of faith might feel turned off by this framework even, worrying that it lessens their personal faith story and experiences. But I personally don't see it like that. I see it quite opposite. Who am I to judge if someone finds wonder and awe looking at the stars at night in the same way that a religious sister experiences receiving communion at Mass? You know, who am I to judge? I think we have so much to learn from each other, and what a powerful movement we could become if we all stood together as equals.
Well
Yeah.
said. Janae, any thoughts on why gender equity should be an issue that all people should be concerned with?
I think it's an issue that all people should be concerned with, because when you look at it, I'm a social work student, and one of the things we learned is one of the core values is the worth and dignity of a human being. That is one of the core pillars and something that you need to respect. And I think whether you're religious or you're not religious, respecting human rights and respecting that people have a voice and that they have dignity is something that we all need to concern ourselves with, because at the end of the day, we're all on this earth together, and we all need to figure out how to honor the people that are here with us and how to support them throughout their lives.
Well said. Sister Joan, thoughts on gender equity and why everyone should care, whether they're a person of faith or a person with no religious tradition?
Well, I think it's just so common. I think the way we started with that, everybody experiences it. You know, you have lunch and you never get a chance to speak with your faculty or something because the guys are running on. Or I chaired a committee, and all at once the 3 men kind of focused together and had a nexus and saw the vision that we could all execute. And I think, oh my. So I think it's important to recognize, as Beth was talking, that this social justice principles come right out of the Gospels. The dignity of the human person, the necessary for having a social world that can, families, and a social civic world that can raise people that care about each other. I mean, these are basic necessities for community in our world. And we've been kind of rocking here the last year. And going back and forth and blaming each other. And I think we need to understand that seeing yourself as treating others as you would be treated yourself is a fundamental kind of empathy that demands that the Christian person walk the walk that others are walking. And in the Black community, I hear over and over in a profound way that, you know, making a way where there's no way, because there isn't. I mean, those people coming up from Central America are doing that, just like it's kind of the history of slavery in America, that it's such a deep thing that when you're put upon like that and not treated with dignity, it comes out. It doesn't die for most people. You know, you have to keep on. And thank God one of the Black women of 100 years ago talked about it being a singing something, you know, that the blues come out, that it's to use all that energy with creativity. And the Black slaves created Black church. And if you've never been to Black church, there is an integration of social justice and personal witness and community that is an incredible legacy. And it really makes that that point that has to be part of the way you live your faith.
Yeah.
And you cited Matthew 25. I mean, I'd cite what is the great commandment? To love God with your whole heart and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. I mean, there it is.
Yeah, perfect. So on that note, we'll turn to some audience questions. Members of our live Zoom audience have been submitting some questions for all of you. Here's our first one. I'm wondering what our speakers think about the Equality Act, legislation before Congress, which would ban discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. The US Catholic bishops and evangelicals have come out against it, while more liberal faith communities have come out in support of it.
You know, it's interesting. I think when we think of equality in principle, like in an objective way and stuff, people tend to challenge it. Like, what does this really mean? When we think of it in an equitable framework, and we think of what the gay person in our lives needs, or the transgender person in our lives, that's different than I think most people recognize the need that people have to be treated well and be able to participate fully in our society.
Yeah. Beth, did you have something to
Yeah,
add?
I would just add, a reminder of what I mentioned before, that there's various voices that are representing the church and in all faith perspectives. And that doesn't surprise me. We are human in church and outside of church.
Yeah,
but I would just say that I think really you can find a home in your faith tradition in whatever voice, you find specific to the Equality Act.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Beth, there's another question that's specifically for you. Can you speak to nonviolent ways to stand up?
Nonviolent ways to stand up to?
Well, that's their wording, but I would guess it's nonviolent ways to perhaps protest or support the marginalized who are among us.
I think we've seen a lot of nonviolent action in this last year that can be our guide. There was many peaceful marches. There was many even online campaigns in the midst of COVID-19. So I think this last year has kind of been a testimony to all the different ways that we can be engaged without moving into violence. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Sister Joan, the next question I think is appropriate for you. Where do you see evidence of gender inequities historically in the church? And what are some of the biggest equity struggles the church faces today?
Well, it's still having a strictly male priesthood, I think, today. But when priestly celibacy took over, became the thing back in the about 1,000 years ago, it was to separate the church and state, so that you didn't have the kings investing the local bishops and stuff. But women took a beating with that. All the worst quotes that tend to come from them, women were demonized in the process, and actually all kinds of women's monasteries closed, because now the priests had the mass, and you could have masses said for the dead, and there was much more attention. Whereas before, people would fund the monasteries for women, join them in their keeping of the hours and things like that. So the male priesthood then had a terrific impact on women's orders. And in the scriptures, in case you think the scriptures didn't have it going on, and still going on, I love to use the example of Peter's mother-in-law, whom Jesus had a fever, They go over to Peter's house after being at the synagogue, and Jesus takes her hand and raises her up from the fever. And then the quotations in the Bible, it says that she began to serve him. In Greek, the word is the same word as for deacon, but a lot of people translate that as, and she began to wait on him, or provide for him. and it puts the woman in a subservient position. So you have an actual woman who's in the story of scripture that's unnoticed, and still today her role is being acculturated, you know, and made to seem subservient, when in fact she's probably one of the women who's at the cross when no men are there. You know, who followed him and served him and stood with him through being crucified. Because that's one of the clue words, when you serve, that's a discipleship word.
Yeah. And that issue of interpretation is really important. And we could spend an hour on that alone, probably.
Yeah.
We do have one more question from our audience. Where are the places and organizations where you see women are working together successfully across all sorts of boundaries to create greater equity? Are there organizations that are doing this well? Yeah, Janae, go ahead.
So I'm going to sing the praises of this place for the rest of my life. And it's called Marion Middle School. It's in St. Louis, Missouri.
Oh, yes.
And I
Yes.
love the place. I went there. I graduated in 2013, and I think it's such an amazing place. But what they do is they help young women, and mostly from a lower income based family. They help prepare them through college and help to support them throughout their entire time. They help give scholarships to college. They help you if you need books. They bought me my calculator for high school. And they check in on you constantly to make sure that you're on track to become the woman that you want to be in your life. So I think Marion Middle School in St. Louis is just such a great opportunity to help push the boundary and make sure people are getting the education that they want and make sure that they're living out what they want to do with their lives.
Yeah.
Are there
So, you
other?
know,
Sister Joan, go ahead.
So yeah, well, I know Sarah Hager, who was the principal there. Yeah. Well, I was thinking, because I wanted to bring it in sometime, that the women auditors at Vatican II kind of hung out with the people that were creating this document that came to be called the Church in the Modern World. And they got into that. They put in that document the statement, any kind of social or cultural discrimination in basic personal human rights on the grounds of sex, race, color, social conditions, language, religion must be curbed and eradicated as incompatible with God's design. So that was women in action to make a statement in a critical document for the church that's still important today.
Really important. Important
Yeah.
words. Yeah.
I've seen people point it out, let's live it. And maybe I've found out in the book, Guests in Their Own House, that the women had done that.
Yeah. Wow. Can any of you speak to or give your thoughts on why gender equity for women, trans, and non-binary persons doesn't hurt or take away from the quality of life of men? In other words, why is gender equity essential for all genders? Feel free to jump in if you have thoughts. It's a
You
big
know, our doctor when I grew up was transsexual. She was coming as Rosemary at the time, but later in her life she came out as Robert. But we all loved her. She was our doctor. We knew her well. She was Catholic. She farmed on the side, but she was prized in the community. She was the director of medicine in the hospital and chair of the school board. I mean, we revered her because we knew her. And I think sometimes when we talk about these things apart from the people, I think we have to know people, is what I'd say. Really know people that are experiencing that in order to understand it better.
Well, we did have more questions from the audience, but unfortunately we can't get to them all today. So thank you to everyone in our audience who submitted questions for our panelists. And we're hopeful that you continue the conversation in your own circles after our discussion here. After hearing these perspectives and experiences related to gender equity, then the natural question for all of us to ask is, where do we go from here? How is change possible? And thankfully, our guests have provided some possible action items for all of us. This is a starting place as we all move forward. Beth, tell us about your action item.
My action item states, raise your voice against gender stereotypes in the entertainment media industry. Now, to begin, that might kind of seem unique that I start there, and that's my advice, but I often find it's helpful when talking about injustices to begin with facts. Females portrayed in positions of leadership on screen are 4 times more likely than similar male characters to be shown nude. This sexual objectification of women affects all of us and continues to shape the psyche of young girls and boys, generation after generation. Males are also twice as likely to be portrayed in leadership roles compared to females, and male characters in general speak twice as many lines. So we might not consciously be aware of this, but unconsciously, this is deeply affecting our culture and our understanding of who we are gender-wise. The Gina Davis Institute, and you'll find a reference on that on the site at cjane.org, has created multiple research studies available to share. So this is one way to kind of get engaged, share, learn, and it includes intersections of gender, race, and LGBTQ and on-screen representation. So with kids and teens engaging what people estimate as more than 7 hours a day on average.
Wow.
I personally find media to be one of the most important factors influencing our values in the 21st century. That's why I name the media such a critical piece to pay attention to.
It's a great action item, and one that we probably just allow to continue because we don't think about it. We don't put that thought toward it. So thank you. Thank you, Beth. Janae, what is your action item?
My action item is to learn more about the women around you, learn their stories, learn their goals, learn what they're passionate about, and learn what they want to fight for, and try and support them in the best way you can. For example, if they have an Etsy shop where they try and sell things to raise money for an organization, purchase something from the Etsy shop, help them with that goal. Or if you can't purchase something financially, maybe spread it to people that you think can, and make sure that the goals that they're trying to accomplish, they have as much resources as they can for it. And also, I think the biggest thing that I've learned, I have been raised by such incredible women and have met so many of them in my lifetime. And I think the biggest thing is hearing their stories, hearing what they're passionate about, what they've gone through, and figuring that out, because not only does it give you a more wider scope of the women around you, but it also helps to educate you on how you can support them in the future. So my action item is just to really listen to the women around you and their journeys, their goals, their aspirations, and really try and support them, because at the end of the day, we're here to support each other and to make sure that we all get to the place we want to be in this world.
I love that action item because it gets at of the issues that we have today, which is women so often are hardest on one another, and it sets us all back from some perspectives. So this flips that. I love it. Thank you. And Sister Joan, what is your action item for us today?
Well, it's a continuing to do what I've been doing, which is try to include lots more about women in all the things we do about the gospel and women in church history too. But I think it's also important I just this weekend attended a conference on Octavia Butler, and there were all kinds of young Black women and men. And I was so stirred by where young people are today to not be limited by the past, but to go beyond it and keep the future open to their creativity. I just think it's a wonderful place for younger people to be. So I'm going to also try to stay in touch with younger people as part of my commitment, and not only pass on what I've learned from the past.
Great. Some solid action items. Thank you, Janae and Beth and Sister Joan. We really appreciate your unique perspectives and the wisdom that you've brought to this conversation. And we're just so grateful for your willingness to share your expertise on this topic. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
And a special thank you to all of those who are behind the scenes making this program possible, from the initial planning stages to tech, promotions, and episode execution. There are so many people who have devoted countless hours to this project and who will continue to do so over the coming year. So thank you. Next month on Exploring Intersections, Catholic Sisters on Migration, Racism, and Climate, Care of Creation. We'll take a look at the massive environmental challenges we face and our responsibilities to address them. What exactly does it mean to care for creation? How do the impacts of climate change affect the most vulnerable? And what are some of the steps we can make to be wise stewards of the Earth's resources and create sustainable future for all of humankind? All of that and more next month on Exploring Intersections. We hope to see you April 14th at 3 p.m. Central Time. Thank you for joining us today. This series is made possible through the Leadership Conference of Women Religious Region 10. Visit our website, exploringintersections.org, to find resources mentioned in today's conversation and to register to attend our next program. We broadcast live every second Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. Central. If you would like to revisit this conversation, you can find a video recording on YouTube or download a podcast version from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or via our website. And be sure to connect with us for the continuing conversation on YouTube and Facebook. I'm Cherish Badzinski, and thanks for tuning in to Exploring Intersections.